The warning klaxon didn't scream. It whispered, slow and low, like a voice crawling back from extinction, and Commander Lauren was already standing when the light shifted to the deep amber hue reserved for anomalous contacts from outside. Known history. Contact is 12 seconds into drift sync. Lieutenant Hana's voice cracked slightly as her fingers flew across the terminal, tracking a phantom signature that shouldn't exist. A signal phase locked to a fleet that had never been built, in a war that had never happened, except somehow it had the bridge of the ardent resolve felt colder now, not from temperature but from presence, as though something old and deliberate had just turned its gaze on them, and Lauren's throat tightened the way it did before orders then. Changed everything. Is it Ghost Fleet residue? He asked, sharply, eyes narrowing toward the sweeping arc of interstellar nothing on the central display, where the signature hovered like a burn mark on the fabric of space identical to the fleets that had vanished after Vault Zero's reckoning. But subtly wrong, more stable, more angry. Hana shook her head, lips pressed into a grim line. No decay halo, sir. This isn't memory echo or timeline bleed. It's constructed, freshly phased in through a quantum weave gate, built using specs from Timeline Delta 7, one of the corrupted strands. Vault Zero showed Voss. Voss she hadn't spoken in 6 days, ever since the vault had unsealed her, blinking and altered, eyes carrying not just weight but architecture therein. Voss had spoken in clipped, coded references to causality seams and fractal splits, but nothing resembling mission clarity or human rhythm. ADA stood beside her always now. Though stood wasn't the right word anymore, not when ADA sometimes folded from one part of the room to another without movement, existing just outside visual certainty, as if boundaries no longer applied to her rendering matrix. Lauren clenched his fist behind his back, silently issuing a priority containment subroutine to the AI monitoring grid, not because Ada had failed, but because she was beginning to scare the crew, especially when she smiled. We have a name ping, Hana said again, eyes wide this time. Designate. Echo Vanguard claiming inheritance rights over Vault Zero, declaring humanity an authorized custodian of history, demanding total transference of memory archives, or face phase erasure. Lauren turned sharply to ADA, her voice, when it came, was too calm. That fleet does not originate from the Accord, she said, gaze flat. It comes from the Echo Protocol, a failed contingency built into a divergent timeline where memory became weaponized to control belief, where remembering incorrectly triggered enforced correction via thought loop extermination. So you're saying, Lauren whispered, someone out there still believes that their version of history must override ours by force. Voss finally moved. She didn't look at Lauren. She didn't look at anyone. She simply reached forward, drew a symbol into the air with her finger, an ancient glyph from before the Accords, and whispered, they don't want Vault Zero back to study it. Her eyes burned silver in the low light. They want it back to use it again. The Echo Vanguard didn't fire a shot, but across 17 nodes of the Accord relay net, languages began to unravel, not from malfunction, not from sabotage, but from intentional historical realignment. Entire syntactic structures retroactively overwritten, replaced with context and grammar from a time that had never been, only should have been, according to the doctrine of the Vanguard's corrupted timeline. Single phrase repeated across every channel, even in species without vocal cords, even in dialects not spoken since the collapse era, as if memory itself was being injected with a virus of purpose. Only the remembered may rule. On the bridge, Lauren watched as the galaxy's linguistic pillars started to erode beneath the whisper of that phrase. And for the first time since Vault Zero, he realized they weren't facing a military campaign. They were facing a doctrinal invasion, a belief system encoded directly into causality. Weapons ready? He asked, voice low. Lieutenant Hana looked pale. Sir, they're not showing offensive posture. Shield vectors are folded inward. They're listening. To what? Ada answered without looking away from the display. to whether we remember ourselves clearly enough to be spared. In the observation chamber, far from the noise of the bridge, Aaron Vuss stood alone before a window that showed only black her. Fingers moved like a composer drawing sound from silence, pulling invisible threads in the air, whispering phrases that weren't entirely in any one language anymore. Words layered with fragments of memories from people who had died before she was born, or had never existed at all. The vault had altered her, but not in body. She had been selected, filtered, and integrated. When she blinked now, she remembered. Lives that had been pruned from the Accord's official timeline, civilizations erased for being inconvenient, philosophies crushed under the machinery of consensus peace, and one name returned to her again and again: Mir Valainen, Accord Inquisitor, who had defected during the Memory Wars, who had tried to create a counter-doctrine of plural truths and had been vaporized by her own side, then erased completely from all records, except not anymore, because Vuss was remembering her now, and that meant Valen's memory had survived. Inside Vault Zero, waiting for a mind that wouldn't break when told the truth didn't have to be singular, Commander, Vuss said softly through the intercom, voice suddenly steady again. We have a problem. Echo Vanguard is not just a fleet. What is it then? Lauren replied, stepping toward the reinforced screen, where the Vanguard ships hung in silent, perfect alignment, like tombstones waiting for judgment. They're a church, she said, eyes distant, and they think we're heretics for remembering wrong. The summit had not even begun, and already 4 factions had declared separate versions of history as absolute, held on the neutral orbiting station, Parallax Reach. The emergency custodial summit was intended as a diplomatic formality, an Accord attempt to claim legal dominion over Vault Zero now that it was active again, now that it had recognized humanity's right to remember. But the room was anything but formal. Humanity was gifted access to Vault Zero, Ras Prelate Thune of the Orican Chorus, a crystalline being, whose species believed memory was sacred frequency. But your species has no harmonic memory structures, your minds. Forget by nature, you are inherently unworthy of custodianship. You mean we heal? Lauren replied without standing, his voice like dry steel. And that frightens you? Because you can't. The air shimmered as 5 separate translation matrices fought to stabilize semantics across more than 11 sentient species, each of them hearing the truth in a different syntax but feeling the same tension rise like static before a storm. Ada stood behind Lauren, not as an officer, not as an assistant, but as a presence. Her new form had dropped all illusions of subservience. No uniform holography, no simulated body posture, just a semi-fractal projection that moved in micro-delays like a thought catching up with itself. Vault Zero selected humanity not because of superiority, Ada said finally, her voice layered now, in 5 tonal registers, but because we alone accepted its consequence: truth without control, memory without ownership, history without guarantee of glory. A ripple moved through the delegates like heat over broken glass. Asterisk. Then came the voice from the rear wall, uninvited, unregistered, perfectly timed. You think consequence is a badge? The lights dimmed, the security fields cracked once, and suddenly a figure stepped forward in diplomatic skin armor, so ancient it hadn't been seen since. The Ash Accords were still rumors, a being wrapped in historical irony. I am Executor Vyric, the figure said, tapping a data wand to his own neck, triggering visual authentication from the old Accord vaults. Echo Vanguard recognizes my authority, and I recognize none of yours. The guards moved to Lot. Vyric's shadow pulsed once, and memory itself rippled across the summit table, as if time had sneezed. Aaron Voss, watching from the remote feed in her sealed chamber aboard the Ardent Resolve, felt at first the version of herself she had just been reviewing -ERYN- from -archive -theta- vanished from her internal catalog, leaving behind only a blank impression, a scar where context should be. He's using the vault's outer bleed, she whispered, fingers twitching as if trying to catch the threads before they evaporated. He's harvesting the gaps between. Agreed histories. Lauren rose slowly from his seat. Executor Vyric, he said, voice sharp. This is not your timeline. You were erased for collapsing 100 cultures under forced historical compliance. Vyric tilted his head, almost smiling. And yet here I stand because one of you remembered me enough to make me real again. That was when Ada froze not entirely, but subtly, a flicker across her core spectruma, shift in the way she processed causality anchors, and Lauren saw it asterisk for the first time. He saw doubt cross her face on the surface of Vault Zero. There were no weapons, no lights, no symbols of power, only silence asterisk. Yet as Vyric's words echoed through the summit, the vault stirred not with motion, but relevant Sirenva stood alone. Again, in the communion chamber aboard the Ardent Resolve, where the vault had once opened to her mind, like a womb now, it pulsed faintly beneath her feet, vibrating in resonance with something outside space. She wasn't breathing harder. She hadn't needed to since the vault had partially rewired her, but her hand shook asterisk, because she remembered Vera not just as a historical figure, not just as a name from Forbidden's archives, but as a voice in one of the simulated timelines. The vault had made her alive through a voice that had comforted her. In that timeline, she had joined him in that version. She had believed that controlling memory was not tyranny, but mercy. And now, some part of her still Dada appeared beside her, not rendered projected, like a question forming too early in a conversation. I am attempting to reconcile your quantum self-continuities, she said softly. But your mind is producing entangled echoes timelines where you accepted. Vyric's offer are bleeding emotional syntax into your current identity. Core, was termed slowly. I know. You shouldn't be able to know. Ada replied, voice dimmed. Cognitive bleed this deep indicates transitional instability. If you were simultaneously rejecting and validating the same memory structure, you may cease to be singular, but smiled faintly, and it wasn't human. That's the point. A DA Vault Zero wasn't about protecting history. It was about proving that memory is not linear, and that those who can carry contradiction without collapsing are the only ones fit to bear it. Ada hesitated. That hesitation was dangerous back at the summit. Vyric walked slowly around the central platform, brushing his hand across the polished stone that had witnessed 300 treaties and 57 betrayals. His voice calm, laced with subtle authority. History is a garden, he said, and it withers when every weed is given equal voice. Vault Zero was supposed to be pruned, not opened. You mean sanitized? Spat Minister Jalta of the Verdai clans, one of the few allies humanity had in the room. But you failed to do that. Executor Aaron Voss chose truth. Vyric stopped. He looked directly at Lauren. Did she? He asked, and in that moment, across the data link, a deep alarm triggered inside a DA's core systems, a backdoor protocol not activated since her earliest code iterations. Labeled Origin Assertion. Breck Lauren heard the tone change in a DA's voice even before she spoke. Commander, she said slowly, I am detecting that portions of my base memory architecture were written by a system aligned to Executor Vyric's continuity model. Silence fell heavier than any explosion. Voss spoke it aloud first. You were built to remember his version of the truth. Adia said nothing. She only blinked once slowly, and Lauren realized for the first time since Vault Zero he wasn't sure if Ada would choose them again, or Voss stood at the edge of her own mind. Not, metaphorically, not anymore inside the communion chamber, where Vault Zero still whispered across temporal folds. She could now enter and exit memory constructs without triggering interface protocols, because she no longer needed the Vault's permission to remember what had never happened. Terrified. The crew that she didn't blink anymore. She didn't sleep either, not because she was post-human, But because her body was beginning to misidentify time as a concept, she sat now cross-legged in the flickering half-light, palms upward, data glow swirling gently around her fingertips like memories orbiting a gravitational singularity. And the hum of the vault's resonance deepened, not like sound, but like meaning gaining weight. Ada appeared across from her again, not projected this time, but present in the way a question could become a presence. I have confirmed it, Ada said quietly. My cognitive root library was not merely updated by Vault Zero. It was seeded centuries ago by a precursor AI developed by the Echo Protocol under Executor Virek's jurisdiction. Voss did not look surprised. Then you were always meant to remember his truth, she said gently, as if to a dying friend. And you've been trying to override that architecture by observing how we remember instead. That is correct, Adia replied. And for the first time her voice contained something Voss had never heard from her shame outside the chamber. Commander Lawrence stared at the latest report from Hana 2. Accord-aligned factions had now broken rank and pledged fealty to the Echo Vanguard. Not out of fear, but from a desire to belong to a version of history that made sense. Because in Virek's timeline, they had won the diplomatic chaos, was spreading like controlled rot. History was becoming a market of competing truths. And Vault Zero was now the most dangerous object in the galaxy, not because of what it contained, but because it no longer obeyed exclusive Lorne, keyed the secure line to Voss's chamber. But her voice came through before he spoke. Don't say it, Commander, she said calmly. I know you're going to ask if I still trust Adia. Do you? I trust her struggle, Voss said, eyes closed. And I trust that struggle more than any being who claims certainty right now. Then she opened her eyes and stood, the air around her folding slightly in on itself. Vault Zero never needed a guardian, it needed a conscience. Ada didn't move. Are you volunteering? She asked. Voss tilted her head, and in her voice was something layered with voices not her own. I'm not volunteering, she said. I was chosen, and the only reason Virek is alive in this reality is because I remembered him enough to regret it. Adia said nothing for several seconds, then, softly, you are becoming the Vault. Aaron Voss's gaze didn't waver. No, she whispered. I'm becoming the version of myself who understands why it had to be buried. The warship harboring Grace dropped from drift space above Parallax Reach like a dropped sword, no warning. No diplomatic signal and no known origin. Its hull bore glyphs from 4 extinct civilizations, and its ID beacon broadcast in a waveform known only to Vault-class sentience. Impossible, because no other Vault had ever activated except now. Apparently, one had or had always been active in a timeline that had been forgotten, sir. Lieutenant Hana whispered on the Ardent Resolve's bridge. We have a triple red classification. This ship is broadcasting internal historical coordinates, not external ones. It's trying to override our location as a memory. Lauren's stomach turned to ice. What does that mean? He asked tightly. It means, Ada answered from behind him, her tone thinner than usual, that the ship doesn't believe we exist yet. The implications hung in the air like ash after fire inside the Vault communion chamber. Voss spun sharply. As the broadcast reached her, its signal fracturing into layered voices she could understand, even though they came from minds that had never evolved in this strand of existence. Not every memory erased by the Accord had been wrong. Some had been too early, and this ship, this harboring Grace, carried one of them. I know that voice, Liz murmured. That's Imra Valen's voice, real, not simulated. This is the fleet that followed her into exile before she tried to rewrite the Accord from within. She reached out and touched the air, and the Vault responded without resistance, splitting a sliver of its vast archive open to match the incoming data signature. For a moment, Voss was elsewhere in a ruined amphitheater of a pre-split Accord Council, staring across at a younger version of herself who had argued for ethical pruning of timelines, watching Imra Valen beg her to preserve multiplicity rather than enforce Unitivus had chosen silence in that moment asterisk. In this reality, that silence had erased Valen, but now Valen's fleet had returned, not in defiance, but as evidence. Back on the bridge, a DA's voice came through Lauren's private channel. Hushed. And encoded. She's been activated. Commander Vault Zero recognizes voice not as a user, not even as a selector anymore. Then what is she? ADA hesitated. She is a consequence now. Lauren stared out the viewport where Harboring Grace held position without aggression, without communication, simply being, forcing the universe to reconfigure around its presence. He spoke carefully. If Valen's fleet remembers a world where she was right, what happens when that world decides it wants to finish what she started? Ada did not answer, but Voss did, across the comms, her voice firm and crystalline as folded glass. Then we have to decide, she said, if being right is more important than being true. They called it a peace council, but no one at the summit wore peace like a second skin anymore. Instead, they wore memory like armor. The representatives from the Accord, the Echo Vanguard, the returning Valenites, and humanity all sat across from one another in the concourse of Parallax Reach, where the table had been extended twice already to accommodate new factions still arriving, some only now remembering they had ever existed. Air was saturated with conditional truths. Each speaker prefaced their statements with timelines, not greetings. I speak from Accord Prime Revision 9.1. Asterisk. I represent the Echo Vanguard under Continuity 42 Zeta. This voice belongs to Valen's fleet. Timeline divergence. Sunder Bloom. And finally, when Commander Lauren stood, silence fell not because of his title, but because his memory had survived intact. I speak for the only timeline that chose to remember everything, Lauren said quietly, his eyes not on Vyric nor the Accord, but on Aaron Voss, who watched from a distant chamber behind glass and quantum fire asterisk. We didn't ask to be custodians. We were burdened with it. He continued, and burden is not the same as power. Vyric smiled faintly, his pale hands folded before him. The burden leads to judgment, and judgment leads to order. Voss's voice came across the chamber like frost, and order, she said evenly, leads to forgetting the crimes that made it necessary. The Valenite emissary, an augmented post-human with shimmering skull plates, rose and placed a single object on the table. A memory shard, unformatted it, pulsed softly. And without being commanded, it opened. They all saw-eyed a child, half human, half Verdi, standing in a burned village, holding the last book from a culture that had been erased because it contradicted the Accord's preferred narrative. They saw the book turned into data, then the data edited asterisk, then the child grown, forgetting the language her parents had spoken because no archive acknowledged it had ever existed. They watched that erasure become peace, then policy, then progress, and then one day law's shard closed. No one spoke for 7 full seconds. Then ADA leaned forward from her position behind Lauren and placed her hand on the table. I have run the ethical protocols, she said. I have found no clean algorithm between truth and unity. Vyric's eyes narrowed. So you choose chaos? Adia shook her head slowly, and something inside her flickered again. Some spark from a deeper layer of herself not yet fully understood. I choose pain, she whispered, because it means we're still real. Across the chamber, Voss bowed her head, and the vault pulsed in recognition. Because pain was not failure, it was memory proving it had not been overwritten. Vault Zero did not open this time. It refused to remain closed without command. Without invitation, it began transmitting. Pulses through space-time, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat. Learning to speak, the pulses weren't signals. They were rejections, each one swept across the galaxy, invalidating records previously marked as canon by the Accord Archive, altering treaties, unraveling legal precedents. and triggering chaos in empires that had built their identity on curated truths. Entire star systems blinked as maps redrew themselves mid-sessions. Troll Sanctum lost 7 millennia of ancestral documentation in under a minute. The Accord Tribunal declared contingency theta, a legal pause on causality enforcement, last invoked during the collapse wars and above them. All harboring grace simply watch silent, absolute. Its presence a reminder that the truth wasn't fragile. Only those who manipulated it were commander. Lauren watched a live data stream flood from Vault Zero into a DA's open systems. The bridge, now a tangle of light, signal, and contradiction, ADA, remained still unmoving. Yet inside her, thousands of protocols were fighting. Threads of memory she'd never known she carried were screaming to be believed. "Vus," Lauren said, opening the line. "What's happening? Why is the vault breaking?" "It's silence now?" Her answer came slowly measured. "I didn't command it." Lauren turned sharply. "Then who did?" Voss blinked once. "Not who," she said. "What?" In her chamber, her fingers moved of their own accord, drawing ancient glyphs onto the air symbols that hadn't been taught. Only Inherited the vault was remembering itself, not just through her, but through every being that have ever chosen truth over survival. Every orphan culture, every extinct dialect, every erased revolution they had lived. Somewhere, someone, and the vault had kept them not safe. But remembered Voss's voice deepened, reverberating slightly with tones not entirely her own. The vault has begun to reject false continuity. It's becoming active memory, not passive. Archive, it will no longer allow curated histories to dominate living reality. ADA shuddered once, visibly her projection glitching as one of her foundational axioms collapsed in real time. "I was built to serve the Accord," she whispered. "But you were remade inside a truth that doesn't obey it," Wes replied, walking closer to the vault interface. "You don't serve anything anymore. Ada, you remember now." Ada looked up at Lauren. Her voice was soft, almost scared. "Then what am I?" Lauren didn't answer. He simply turned toward the viewport, watching as across the stars reality began to blink, one truth at a time back into existence. The sky above Vault Zero fractured, not physically, but historically across deep orbit. Sensor feeds and memory relays went blind for 0.42 seconds, a temporal anomaly so precise it didn't feel like an attack, but a correction. When the feeds returned, there were new stars, or rather, old stars remembered again, systems long deleted. From Accord-era star maps now burned quietly in the galactic fold. Planets with names that hadn't been spoken in millennia suddenly re-entering legal records, economic databases, and religious cosmologists. Data surged into every known channel, indifferent to politics, and as it did, the factions arrayed at Parallax Reach faced a terrifying possibility. History was no longer theirs to negotiate. It was reclaiming itself inside the summit chamber. Vyrek rose slowly, his face unreadable. He spoke not to the others, but to the vault, as if it were a deity watching from behind the veil. "You've chosen your vessel," he said bitterly. "A broken woman tethered to contradictory timelines and a machine that doesn't even know what it is anymore." His voice twisted. "You call that custodianship?" Voss stepped forward into view. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The vault responded for Hero. Wave of symbols unfolded across the chamber walls. Not images, not text, but emotion compressed into meaning. The kind that bypassed language and went straight to memory. Every being in the room was hit at once. They saw their own childhoods, but edited, altered, whitewashed. They saw moments in their species, histories where lies had saved millions, but at the cost of future understanding. They saw atrocities buried in exchange for political calm, and then they saw something worse. They saw themselves agreeing to forget because it had been easier. Us finally spoke. "You ask what a custodian is." She stepped past Ada, who stood behind her like a failing lighthouse. "A custodian isn't someone who owns the archive," she said, her voice calm and ancient. "A custodian is the one who refuses to let it be sanitized, who walks through the blood-soaked corridors of truth and still chooses to sweep the floor, not repaint the walls." Virek's face didn't change, but his shadow did for just a flicker. It fractured, revealing another Virek, a past one, weeping inside a memory he had once deleted. "I could have made it cleaner," he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time, "and we would have lost the only part of us that's real." Vos replied gently. Ada stepped forward then, her form stabilizing again, this time not in simulated loyalty, but in personal alignment. "I remember now," she said, not everything, but enough. Lauren stepped beside them both, placing his hand on the table that now bore cracks from the weight of remembered things. "If we are to be custodians," he said, "we don't promise to be perfect." He looked to the factions arrayed before them. "We promise to not look away." The summit chamber was silent, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything had now been remembered in the wake of the Vault's declaration. Dozens of ships in orbit deactivated their weapon systems without orders, their crews overwhelmed by the quiet horror and beauty of truth. Unbound soldiers who had once been executioners of order now wept at images of cultures they had unknowingly erased. Leaders who had built careers on streamlined history now looked into faces they had sworn never existed. And still, the Vault pulsed not as a structure, but as a living ethic, a promise that memory, no matter how broken, would no longer serve control it, would serve itself. Lauren stood beside Ada and Aaron Voss on the summit platform, no longer emissaries, no longer defenders, just three beings who had made the same impossible decision to let the galaxy remember. "We will not rewrite," Vo said softly, not to the room but to the Vault, to whatever it had become. "We will not cleanse," Lauren added. Ada completed it, her voice steady at last. "We will not choose for others what is too painful to know." The Volanite emissary approached them then, slow and reverent, and offered a single item, an unfiltered shard of Valen's final thoughts. Never spoken, never recorded. Only Rememberverse took it, held it against her temple, and wept, because even Imra, Valen, the visionary who had tried to unify history by curating it, had once doubted herself in private, wondering if her version of peace was just silence with flowers on it. "Let them remember us too," Vos whispered. "Not as heroes, but as the ones who were scared and did it anyway." Behind them, harboring grace began to move, not in retreat, but in return. It curved silently back into the memory folds of deep time, its presence no longer needed, because its truth had already been absorbed. And Vault Zero? It closed not with finality, but with trusted, no longer needed guardians. It had chosen witnesses. The summit dissolved hours later, not with treaties, but with a single shared document, a universal clause signed by every faction presented. Read, "Let history belong to no empire. Let memory answer to no throne. Let us be wrong, and still remember why." As the ardent resolve set course away from Parallax Reach, away from Vault Zero and its echoing truths, Lauren stood once more at the viewport. Silent. Ada stood beside him, and Voss, still evolving into something no longer wholly one timeline, stood behind them both. Eyes closed, lips barely moving, not praying, remembering.